Well, the noise in the background may not stop me. I want to say a little bit as a kind of vlog, as a self-recording, just really to document things. I never ever go back and listen to my own videos, so if there are some kinds of problems with them, I try to pick up any developing problem as it may go along, but if there's some kind of buzz or interruption in the video, I cannot know unless people tell me. And even though I'm making this as a kind of a diary, I really will probably just reflect on what I've said, and it will consolidate here and now, and I won't ever go back and listen to myself again. But what I wanted to say is one really key point that the psychologist has caused me to reflect upon ever since I had a session last week on Monday has been that I have throughout my life been under an extreme amount of stress, and I have normalized that stress. I've deemed it to be, oh, everybody is under this extreme amount of stress. But then she says, no, they're not. They're actually not. They don't have that level of feeling the pressure on them all the time, and feeling a performance anxiety all the time, and feeling guilty, and feeling anxious. And even though the guilt and anxiety came to a head with the hormonal issues I've been facing, and under the umbrella of perimenopause, the stress and the anxiety and the tension and the guilt I've had have been there ever since, I guess, since the point of migration, more or less, the point of radical uprooting, more or less. I remember we had about 1 year reprieve, but it was kind of bland and in the realm of the nondescript, and the first year after we migrated, it was just an empty situation. Not bad, but not good either. And definitely not totally good, in the sense of not totally absent of the bad. I do remember my father began to be a strict disciplinarian during that time. I do remember See, like the thing with Rhodesian society is that it was stratified in every possible way, and especially children had their own zone and adults had their different zone, and the nuclear family therefore had reduced power, oddly enough, in that context. Despite it being a very far right-wing culture, the nuclear family really in some ways was reduced in terms of its overall psychological determinism and its emotional potency. Now, I remember the first year when we migrated, and I was somebody who really had my own sense of self as a teenager, as what I wanted to do, who I was, what I was developing into becoming. And my father was irate one day because he had organized a get-together with some of his friends, and I think they had kids, and I was supposed to go along just to conform and to be sociable and that kind of obligatory matter. And he was irate because I didn't get dressed quick enough, and then when I got dressed, it wasn't appropriate, it wasn't formal enough, and he thought I should have known that, and I couldn't find anything because I really didn't have a lot of clothing. You talk about poor white, we were poor whites in effect. All the clothes were hand-downs, so I only ever bought clothing maybe once or twice in my previous life. I relied totally on hand-downs. And he was like, well, you didn't find something that was appropriate, and how dare you? And so then we went on this get-together, which was really get-together with these fuddy-duddies, kind of picnic scenario. We sat near the river, but it was really awful, because all the libido had gone out of life, and all the energy, and all the wildness, the wilderness experience. And this was a very, very tame glossed over green grass experience. I always think of the green grass that I encountered upon migration as being a superficial kind of sealant over the wild, and I sensed that the British people who came to Australia, they wanted Britain. They were sent here as not slaves, as convicts, and they yearned for Britain, and they saw the Australian wilderness as an offence, as an affront, something they didn't like to encounter, and they tried as much as possible to whitewash it and seal it over with this very green, platted lawn everywhere, make it disappear. And I felt very uneasy about the Australian environment back in the 80s. I think it has improved a great deal. People are understanding more what nature is and what the Australian wilderness is in its own right. But back then it was a horrible, horrible sensation. And so we went to this picnic near the river, and it's just a horrible sensation where suddenly I was supposed to be an adult, except I was still a teenager, still very wild at heart, and I was supposed to sit with the ladies, and there was gender segregation, and they would sort of cross their legs over, and they would, how are things going? Is it all right? And would you like some more tea? And that's really not what I like. It's not who I am. It's not how I'm thinking. I want my friends. I want the wild. I want my freedom to come and go, and instead we're like sitting in this cross-legged way. I remember feeling very, very awkward indeed, that I hadn't got any suitable underwear to wear either, and my top seemed to be a little bit see-through in a very sort of distressing way. And I was just sort of sitting there and going, this is awful. This is like, I'm not my mother, but I'm being treated like I am, and I'm supposed to think like her and respond in this very lame way about everything. And I was doing this because my father demanded that I be there, and that I conform, and that I integrate with the group of people that were now his new set of friends. His and my mother's new set of ex-Rhodesian friends. And they were very, very, very old-fashioned old biddies. It was just too bad. And then they said, oh, well, don't you want to go for a ride on these plastic, machine contraptions, kind of like a tractor that you pedal through the shallows of the river? And I thought, no, I really, really don't. It's just, compared to being on a horse and galloping where you want to go, it's just, it's just such a letdown, and I feel like a fool, like a cartoon. And they said, no, go on, give it a go, have a go. It's not so bad. And, and I went and did it, and I hated it, and it didn't have a meaning to me, and it made me feel ridiculous. And basically, that's the mood and the mindset I had as a new migrant. Just sort of ridiculous, awkward. This is such a come down. This is such a letdown. Who am I expected to be? Why is it never good enough? Why am I supposed to be this very, very fake, very pompous, superficial adult when I'm still feeling wild and energetic inside? Where are my friends? Where is nature? Where's the adventure? Where's the spirit of unity? Where's anything that makes sense anymore? Why are we reduced to being fuddy-duddies and prematurely old? But my father insisted on it. Well, that's just recapturing the past, but one view I've had is regarding the stress, regarding the amount of tension. I caught every virus that was going around in that first year because I really was desperately unhappy. My circadian rhythms, my sense of night and day were really messed with because there were outdoor lights that never went off. And I didn't feel that change that you do in Africa, where you suddenly transition around 6 p.m. into a nighttime mode, and the mood takes you over, and it lulls you into sleep, and it's a deep sense of the wilderness coming in, and civilization retracting. I didn't feel it. I felt civilization always pressing in on me, and it just felt like I was alive but dead. That was the beginning of when I started to get sick. I became very disoriented with my immune system, and very vulnerable. But it really did get a hell of a lot worse, and I really don't think I have depicted or would even be capable of depicting how bad it got. Um, but even to the psychologist, she thinks my father might have been a sensitive soul underneath. This is like the depiction of the modern personality. They seem hard and gruff, but underneath they're just a sensitive soul. I don't think so. I think it's there was sensitivity there, but I think my father was and is and whatever. He's had a stroke, but so far as it went, a very authoritarian, very old-fashioned personality. And the other thing is how bad it got. Now this is what is not, it cannot be understood through the lens of modern psychology. I'm starting to realize this more and more. Let me state that point again. It cannot. It seems not, absolutely seems not to be able to be understood through the lens of modern psychology. But my father had this notion. Do you know how in the past they used to talk about breaking horses? The horse was rebellious. You got a horse from the wilderness. You wanted to tame it and make it rideable, so the cowboy sat on its back. It bucked and bucked and bucked, tried to get you off. Finally, its spirit was broken, and then you had broken the horse. You could ride it to your heart's content. That used to be the old way. What people don't understand, and what even I couldn't process effectively because I didn't have the conceptual means or apparatus, my father tried to break me. He thought that the answer to civilization and the answer to adjustment and conformity was to break me and to break us down. And any sign that there was no adaptation meant there's still a rebellious spirit there. Break them further. He actually subscribed to that ideology. And that's something I can't convey to somebody in modernity because they think it doesn't register well. They think fathers do something else. Fathers are like something else. And it must be a misunderstanding. But it's not kind to me to presume that, and really it hasn't been a misunderstanding on my part. Just because I've had trouble articulating it doesn't mean that I haven't experienced it as very, very negative and very destructive. So in effect, my father set out to hand me over as a fully domesticated animal to the new authorities in Australia because Rhodesia had been shown to be defunct, of course, non-viable. In another way, also denied by God itself or himself. Because my father was a very religious character and thought that God was on their side in Rhodesia, and then, God handed Rhodesia over to new masters and handed the whites over to new masters in their different situation in the diaspora. So therefore, those were the justified new masters in God's eyes. So Jennifer has to be handed over to the new authorities in Australia. If she doesn't conform, it's because she has a rebellious spirit and she needs to be broken. And my father, in effect, broke me. He broke my health. I had a really, really bad ability to develop energy to combat any virus, to cope with any emotional situation. He broke my health. So I could be handed over to the authorities, no doubt. And they would do with me what they wanted, but I would be really domesticated, very civilized. And he broke me down emotionally. Every time I encountered a difficulty with anybody or any situation in Australia, any growing pains, any bump along the road, his solution was, you're too spirited, you need to be broken down more. And this is what modern people can't understand. They think, oh, you're just being sensitive, you're being overreactive. It's not, it could never have really been as you say. It was as I said. And this is why I was at a severe disadvantage with regard to the very thing my father cared about, which was adaptation to the norms of the new civilization. Adaptation really at any cost. Otherwise, it's shameful. Shameful to my father. And really, in a way, shameful to me. I felt very, very ashamed because I learnt If I didn't adapt, I should feel ashamed. If I didn't give what was expected of me, I ought to feel very ashamed, and I do, and I have felt ashamed, and I felt guilty too. Because these were ideas impressed on me at a very young age. Feel guilty, feel ashamed. If you're feeling sick, that's because you have a weak will. You should feel ashamed. How disgusting. My parents used to say, how disgusting you are. You've got this irritable bowel syndrome and you burp, and we can hear it from our bedroom room. How disgusting. You need to be forcibly converted to right-wing Christianity. You can't even speak properly. They sought to break me down. And this is what's not understood. This is, it has only been made so much more clear to me. It's an ideology, you can't say my parents are bad people, by the way. It's just they had a very bad ideology, and nobody corrected them because nobody listened to me. I just did not have the technical tools or the convincibility to explain it to anybody. And also this modern skepticism, it can't be that bad. It could never have been that bad. Well, yes, it was. So this is why I had no emotional resources to adapt, but adaptation was the imperative, or else shame and guilt. And I had no money, no material resources to adapt, but adaptation was the imperative. And I didn't have any buffer zone between me and the new reality. I couldn't say, well, this is who I am, and I resist some demand that you're making because that's too much or it's unfair. I had no real buffer zone. I had to develop it eventually through learning that I gave too much away, that I tried too hard, that I was way too earnest. And all I wanted to do was adapt, but I didn't defend myself or my individuality or my own rights or my own interests because I hadn't learned to do that. So my parents actually had the opposite training, that I should, if someone asked me, like, do more for me, I must. Absolutely must. And don't hold anything back, even if it kills you, basically. So I had to fight my parents to develop a little bit of a resourcefulness, a space for myself, a buffer zone just for me. I had to learn eventually by my mid-20s. It took a long time to say no. And that was really painful for me. It wasn't something I was used to doing. It felt wrong. Initially, it felt like I was really opening myself up to a lot of guilt and shame by saying no, but I had to fight my parents because their ideology was wrong. And there was some good intention in their minds, and there still is, but their ideology was very, very upside down and back to front. And this is something, because I only had the modern conceptual notions like narcissism or some other thing from modernity to try to explain this. It wasn't possible, and especially in the very early days of just growing up in an alien culture, it really wasn't possible to say, actually, I don't know what's wrong, but something's wrong, and it has to be addressed, or else I will be in even worse straits. And it did get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. It came to its head in about 1997, when I was a victim of ongoing power harassment in the workplace, and partly because I didn't know how to defend my boundaries, and partly I just wanted to fulfill that criteria of conforming at any cost. But I had, by then, all sorts of impediments. I was in very bad physical health, but I couldn't articulate it or explain it without feeling deeply guilty and ashamed. I had, it's hard, I guess, for people to understand extreme fatigue, very compromised immune system, foggy thinking, that kind of thing, constant sinus infections, just really unwell all the time, and confused about the environment and unsure what I was supposed to do except conform. Just really a conforming zombie trying to weather a very horrible sandstorm for 10 or more years. So like the psychologist said, I have been under much more stressed than anybody is really, and I've normalized it, and that's a thing I need to come to terms with, and that's a means by which I will regain my health and my understanding, and even conquer this perimenopause, I think. But just realizing, give myself a break. Wow, why not? I've been through so much, and no one else has given me a break. Not really, not really. It's just too hard to explain how bad things were. They think it's just an exaggeration, I'm sure, but it really was that bad. So maybe that's all I have to say. Um, yeah, always putting myself under pressure, always feeling guilt and shame, but never having had the resources, never having had anything that a normal person actually brought up within this contemporary culture would have had. No parental support or emotional resources, no knowledge or orientation to the environment, no sense of the environment having any intrinsic meaning, no understanding of how to socialize, but an imperative to do so anyway. No feeling that it was attractive to socialize with people who were very, very different from me. The kids of my age, the peers, they had nothing in common with me, but I was under this imperative to socialize with them. Very, very stressful. And then to cover up all this autoimmune problem and make it seem like nothing, because that would have made me even more ashamed and brought down my parents' rage even more severely, because it's non-conformity, meaning I have to be broken more. And isn't that weird? Just you're succumbing to the abuse, succumbing to the violence, succumbing to the confusion and the disorientation. That itself is viewed as non-conformity and needing more punishment in order to correct it. So my parents had totally a very false, very wrong, very hostile, very aggressive ideology, not because they're bad people, but because nobody would help me to correct them. And I will say it again, I did ask, I did appeal to everybody I thought might be wise in the society, might have some authority, and they all took my father's side. Basically, all were just simply very, very passive. Very, very passive indeed. So talk about hostility, talk about negativity, talk about not being believed. That adds even more stress onto you. That makes you feel terrible and really confused, really guilty and ashamed in a lot of ways. Like, couldn't I have done better? What was wrong with me? Maybe my father was right, that I'm really rubbish. Otherwise, others would have taken my side instead of his. So there it is. Just coming to terms with all the stress and grief that I've been under that I haven't really realized before, because I've developed quite a lot of stoicism and the capacity to dissociate from it just out of necessity. And I haven't really realized that somehow I'm also my own worst critic and above all, the harshest person on myself. And I'm training myself not to be.